The night felt strangely alive on August 6, 1943, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath over the Solomon Islands. At exactly 2,333 hours, the calm was broken when the USS Dunlap's radar operators caught sight of 4 Japanese destroyers creeping across the black surface of Vela Gulf at 29,500 yards. That single radar blip became the spark for one of the most decisive and doctrine-shattering engagements of the Pacific War. Commander Frederick Moose Moosbrugger, the rugged and sharp-minded leader of Task Group 31.2, instantly understood the weight of the moment. The Japanese destroyers had no idea they had been detected, and that ignorance would cost them dearly. Moosbrugger had studied Japanese night tactics for months. He knew they favored aggressive night attacks, using the famous long lance torpedoes to rip apart American ships before they could react. Tonight, however, the advantage belonged entirely to him. His ships, silently slicing through the dark water, were equipped with far superior radar systems, giving them the power to see without being seen. It was the kind of edge commanders dream of, but only if they have the nerve to use it correctly. There were only 17 minutes now until the first torpedoes would crash into steel hulls. 17 minutes until 3 Japanese destroyers would vanish from the surface. 17 minutes in which every decision, every turn of the wheel, every adjustment of range would define the fate of men and machines locked in this shadowy duel. As the Japanese formation kept gliding forward, unaware of the American presence, Task Group 31.2 moved into position like a hunter stalking prey. Moosbrugger ordered his destroyers to maintain radio silence, trusting the crew to execute the doctrine they had rehearsed relentlessly. The darkness around them wasn't a threat, it was their camouflage, their weapon. The sea looked calm, but beneath the surface lay tension so thick it felt like a living thing. Radar pings continued to pulse in the Dunlap CIC room, glowing outlines marking enemy shapes that no human eye could have spotted. Operators leaned forward with clenched jaws, tracking speed, bearing, and distance with a precision born from training and fear. They knew that the Japanese destroyers were not lightweights, each carried dozens of deadly torpedoes that could cripple or sink an American ship in a single blow. Yet tonight, for the first time, those long lances were pointed in the wrong direction. The Japanese believed they owned the night, just as they had earlier in the war. They believed their tactics were unmatched. But the battlefield had changed, and they didn't know it. Moosbrugger planned to flip the script entirely. Instead of closing in for a gun battle, the Japanese specialty, he would strike first with torpedoes. His strategy was elegant and ruthless: unleash an unexpected torpedo barrage from extreme range, then swing his gun destroyers into position to finish the job after the explosions threw the Japanese line into chaos. The plan meant that the opening blow would land before the Japanese even realized they were under attack. The American destroyers adjusted their angles, crews racing to their torpedo mounts, silently preparing for the order that would ignite the night. At 2,347 hours, the perfect firing solution formed. The range narrowed. The torpedoes locked onto their paths. Moosbrugger's voice broke the silence: fire. The tubes erupted with compressed blasts, sending American torpedoes streaking into the darkness like underwater arrows. Dozens of them slipped silently beneath the waves, threading through the blackness toward 4 ships that had no idea death was already swimming toward them. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Every man on the American decks held his breath, listening for the first distant explosion. Then, a flash on the horizon. A low rumble. Water and flame burst skyward. One Japanese destroyer was torn open instantly. A second blast followed, brighter, louder. The second destroyer staggered as if it had been punched by a giant. The night erupted with orange light, smoke curling upward from the stricken vessels. The Japanese had no time to react, no time to understand that the Americans had reinvented night combat in the span of a few seconds. Moosbrugger watched the chaos unfold exactly as he had predicted. Japanese searchlights began to stab the darkness, swiveling wildly as officers screamed for bearings, for targets, for responses that no longer mattered. The formation was broken. The Japanese command structure was shattered. Now came the finishing blow. The gun destroyers, Chevalier and Sterret, surged forward. Their main batteries opened fire with rapid, disciplined precision. Shells ripped through the night, punching through superstructures and igniting ammunition lockers. The Japanese ships returned fire, but their shots were scattered, panicked, and too late to matter. The Americans had seized control of the night and turned it into a weapon. Within minutes, 3 Japanese destroyers were burning wreckage drifting helplessly across Vella Gulf. The 4th fled into darkness, lucky to escape with its hull intact. For the first time, the Japanese Navy, masters of night ambushes since 1941, had been ambushed themselves. By 23:50 hours, the battle was essentially over. 17 minutes had rewritten the playbook of naval warfare. Radar had proven not just useful, but war-changing. Moosbrugger's tactics would be studied, copied, and praised for years to come. The victory did more than sink ships, it shifted the psychological balance of the Pacific. The Americans weren't just learning. They were evolving, adapting faster than the Japanese could counter. And on that August night, Task Group 31.2 proved that the darkness no longer belonged to Japan. The first explosions were still echoing across Vella Gulf when Commander Moosbrugger stepped deeper into the Combat Information Center, his eyes fixed on the glowing radar scopes that were rewriting the rules of naval combat in real time. Moments earlier, his torpedo destroyers had landed a devastating surprise blow on the Japanese formation, but Moosbrugger knew the job wasn't finished. Battle at sea was never simple, never guaranteed, never a straight line from plan to victory. Even crippled enemies could be deadly. And the Japanese, wounded or not, were still some of the most skilled night fighters in the world. The CIC was dim except for the green radar screens pulsing like mechanical hearts. Operators leaned in, headphones clamped tight, tracking the fading shapes of 2 dying Japanese destroyers drifting apart like torn fabric. A third contact remained moving erratically, damaged but still afloat. And then there was the 4th, now accelerating, trying to break free into the night. Every man in the room knew they only had seconds to decide what to do next. The battle wasn't over. It was evolving. Moosbrugger's mind worked at a speed that stunned even his officers. He had spent months studying Japanese retreat patterns, night maneuvers, and their instinctive reliance on long lance torpedoes even in desperation. A wounded Japanese destroyer was a dangerous animal, unpredictable and often more willing to lash out. If it managed to launch a spread of torpedoes while fleeing, it could still cause catastrophic damage. The Americans had stolen the night, but night battles were a gambler's game. One misread, one wrong angle, one unlucky torpedo, the margin of survival was razor thin. Outside on the decks, sailors watched the burning silhouettes of the enemy ships flicker like ghostly lanterns. Smoke rose in thick ropes, illuminated by flashes of secondary explosions. The air smelled of hot steel, shattered wood, and fuel burning on the surface of the water. Each gun crew remained at the ready, hands gripping metal, eyes scanning the horizon where the 4th destroyer's silhouette had vanished. Suddenly, a radar operator called out a new bearing. The fleeing Japanese destroyer had turned sharply, too sharply for a retreat. Moosbrugger instantly understood the meaning. It wasn't running. It was preparing an attack. The Japanese captain, desperate and furious, was positioning for a final torpedo launch. It was the classic Imperial Navy instinct: if you're doomed, at least take an enemy with you. But Moosbrugger was ready for this. His plan had always accounted for the Japanese instinct to strike back even in the face of defeat. He ordered the gun destroyers, Sterret and Chevalier, to break formation and accelerate. Their engines roared, sending vibrations through the decks as they surged forward, seawater chopping violently under their hulls. The night turned into a deadly game of angles, each side trying to cross over and line up a perfect firing solution. Inside the Japanese destroyer, chaos reigned. Shouts. Sparks. Smoke filling corridors. Wounded men struggling to keep stations operational. But the captain was determined to launch his torpedoes. He knew radar gave the Americans perfect vision in the dark, but at the right moment, at the right angle, even a blind counterattack could turn the tide. Japanese torpedo men scrambled to flood their tubes, voices hoarse from heat and exhaustion. The deck tilted slightly, not from steering, but from internal damage. Their world was collapsing, but their resolve was intact. They would not run without attempting one final strike. The Americans saw the maneuver forming on radar before the Japanese could even finish lining up their tubes. Moosbrugger ordered immediate evasive changes, breaking the American destroyers into two separate attack arcs. This forced the Japanese to guess which angle to target, dividing their focus at the worst possible time. The American guns opened fire again, their shells ripping through the night with white-hot cracks. The sea flashed with muzzle bursts that lit up the decks like lightning. American rounds began punching through the Japanese superstructure, one through the bridge, another through the aft torpedo mount, and a third exploding near the funnel, sending a geyser of flames skyward. Still, unbelievably, the Japanese destroyer kept trying to launch its torpedoes. Sterett closed in first. The crew could now see the enemy ship clearly, flames licking the mast, smoke trailing behind like a funeral veil. They fired again. More shells smashed into the Japanese hull, shattering machinery and igniting a fresh fire near the forward deck. The Japanese torpedo tubes glowed cherry red from heat. Men were still there, still trying to aim, coughing through smoke, their silhouettes flickering like shadows in a dying lantern. But just as they were about to fire, an American shell struck the torpedo mount directly. The explosion was instant and catastrophic. A white blast ballooned outward, followed by a rolling fireball that swallowed the midsection of the Japanese ship. The torpedoes inside cooked off like a chain of depth charges. The destroyer broke in half almost immediately, sinking within minutes. But the danger wasn't over. The fourth and last Japanese destroyer, the only one still unhit, had used the chaos to slip into a shadowy corner of the Gulf. It wasn't trying to attack. It was trying to escape and warn the rest of the Japanese fleet. If it survived and carried news of this defeat, Japanese admirals might change their tactics, adjust their convoy routes, or reinforce future night operations. Moosbrugger couldn't allow that. A tactical victory meant nothing if the enemy learned the lesson. Radar contacts flickered as the last destroyer hugged the coastline. The Americans adjusted course at flank speed, engines howling. But the Japanese ship was faster than expected, weaving through the darkness, its captain determined to survive even if everyone else had died. The chase became a silent race, the Americans relying on radar trails, the Japanese relying on blackness. After nearly 10 minutes, the radar operator called out a fresh lock. The destroyer had turned too far toward open water, exposing itself. Sterett opened fire at long range, and the shells landed close enough to send towering columns of water smashing onto the enemy's bow. That was enough. The Japanese captain abandoned the escape. He fired a last spread of torpedoes, wild, poorly aimed, more symbolic than tactical, and vanished into the darkness at full speed. The Americans adjusted course, avoided the torpedoes, and finally let the ship go. They had won. Completely. The Gulf was theirs. And in less than 20 minutes, they had shattered the myth of Japanese night invincibility. The battle in Vella Gulf was over, but its shockwaves were just beginning to ripple through the Pacific. Dawn had not yet touched the water when the fires from the burning Japanese destroyers started to dim, leaving only drifting wreckage, patches of oily flame, and silence where moments earlier chaos had thundered. Commander Moosbrugger stood on the bridge of the Dunlap with his officers, looking out over the aftermath with a mixture of triumph and gravity. Victories at sea were never clean. They always came wrapped in the sobering reality that hundreds of men, even enemy men, had vanished into the dark in mere minutes. Radar had delivered an utterly decisive blow, but it had also exposed something deeper. The era of traditional Japanese night supremacy was officially dead. For years, Japanese destroyer crews had trained relentlessly in night combat, rehearsing ambushes with a level of precision that had stunned American forces early in the war. Their long lance torpedoes were legendary, fast, long-ranged, and so silent that many of their victims never saw or heard them coming. But on this night, the tables flipped entirely. Instead of the Japanese creeping up unseen on American vessels, it was the Americans who moved like ghosts, guided by radar that painted the ocean with invisible lines of awareness. Moosbrugger's tactics had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outplanned a doctrine that the Japanese Navy had believed was untouchable. And the speed of the Victory, 17 minutes from first torpedo to the sinking of the third ship, left no room for debate. The Americans had mastered the night. Back in the CIC, radar operators kept sweeping the Gulf for any surviving contacts. The air still smelled of burned paint and hot metal. You could feel a strange tension, that liminal period after battle when adrenaline remains but the danger has slipped away. Sailors spoke quietly, as if the ocean might still be listening. Reports came in from gun crews, ammunition expended, barrels overheated, minor mechanical issues, but no American casualties. Not one. That fact alone felt unbelievable, almost unfair. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, a 4th chased into the dark, and not a single American life lost. It was the kind of outcome naval commanders dream of but rarely see. Moosbrugger allowed himself a moment to exhale. He knew how fragile that margin could be. Had the Japanese captain launched his torpedoes 30 seconds earlier, or had the Americans misread a radar sweep by just a few degrees, the story of this night might have been far bloodier. Night battles could turn on the smallest error. Fate often played a cruel role. But tonight, everything aligned: training, timing, machines, men. And in the back of Moosbrugger's mind, he knew this battle would become a model for future engagements. The tactics used here would ripple outward, transforming every destroyer squadron in the Pacific. The sailors who witnessed the burning hulks drifting across the Gulf understood the magnitude of what they had done. Some leaned against the railings, staring at the orange glow still flickering on the water. Others moved quietly among their stations, cleaning equipment or checking damage reports. War had hardened all of them, but nights like this still felt surreal, where precision and planning had collided with the brutal simplicity of survival. One sailor later admitted that the eerie glow of the sinking Japanese ships reminded him of bonfires back home, except these fires marked the end of men's lives, not the beginning of celebrations. As the minutes passed, the last Japanese destroyer that escaped sent no signals, no flares, no radio transmissions. It simply disappeared into the widening blackness. Moosbrugger doubted it would make it far. Even if the ship miraculously avoided American patrols or aircraft at dawn, it would not escape the psychological weight of this defeat. The Japanese Navy had relied so heavily on night combat that losing supremacy in this domain would rattle their confidence deeply. Commanders back in Rabaul or Truk would demand explanations. How had 4 ships been ambushed? Why hadn't Lookout spotted the Americans? Why had long lances failed to appear? And worst of all, how did the Americans fire first in the darkness? Those questions would haunt the Japanese for weeks. But on this night, on these ships, the Americans simply got back to work. Victory didn't erase procedure. Fire control crews ran checks, engine rooms reported temperatures, and officers compiled detailed logs that would later be studied by naval intelligence. Radar operators marked their final plots of the night, preserving the exact paths of the enemy ships so analysts could reconstruct the battle. Even now, the Americans were thinking ahead: how to improve, how to adapt, how to replicate this dominance. Moosbrugger stepped out onto the starboard walkway where the wind carried away the last traces of smoke from the battle. Behind him, the horizon was beginning to lighten, just a faint hint of gray spreading across the sky. The Gulf that had erupted with violence barely an hour earlier now lay quiet and seemingly peaceful, its surface reflecting the settling embers of burning debris. The Americans weren't celebrating. They didn't feel the need to. The victory spoke for itself, and its implications were far bigger than the immediate battlefield. This wasn't just a tactical win. It was a doctrinal victory. A psychological victory. A technological victory. It was the moment when radar stopped being just an instrument and became a decisive weapon. Hours later, when the sun finally rose, the Gulf revealed the full extent of the destruction. Pieces of shattered hull plating, charred wooden beams, and small patches of lifeboat debris floated across the surface like remnants of a shipyard explosion. The American destroyers cruised slowly past the wreckage, documenting what they could. They had no illusions about the brutality of war. Every twisted piece of metal had been part of a ship filled with trained, disciplined men fighting for their own cause. Moosbrugger observed quietly, knowing that the lessons learned tonight would save American lives in future battles, but also knowing that each victory added to a growing weight every commander carried. As the task group turned northward, leaving the wreckage behind, the sea gradually swallowed the final embers of the Japanese ships. The night that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to the Americans. And no matter how many battles remained in the Pacific, no matter how fierce, how costly, how chaotic, the memory of Vella Gulf would stand as the moment the balance shifted in the dark. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when the full weight of the night's events settled over Task Group 31.2. What happened in Vella Gulf wasn't just another victory, it was the kind of moment that rewrites manuals, shifts strategies, and forces entire navies to rethink who controls the sea after dark. As the American destroyers cut through the soft morning light, Moosbrugger received the first set of after-action updates from his officers. Damage reports, minimal. Ammunition used, documented. Casualties, none. Incredibly, almost unbelievably, the Americans had emerged untouched from a battle against an enemy historically known for dominating the night. This was more than skill. This was evolution. Moosbrugger walked the length of the deck slowly, absorbing the calm of the morning. The sailors he passed gave him nods of respect, still riding the adrenaline of their triumph but also sinking into quiet reflection. Many of them knew that battles like this didn't happen often, a strike so precise, so overwhelming, that the enemy simply dissolved under the weight of it. The men who had watched the torpedoes flash across the water hours earlier now stood in the gentle breeze, their hands resting on the railings, listening to the rhythmic calming splash of the sea. The tension had broken, leaving behind that strange, almost sacred calm that follows any violent clash. Below deck, the radar crews were winding down after a night of intense focus. Sweat-stained headphones lay coiled on consoles, charts covered with penciled-in paths were rolled and stored, and the screens that had glowed green with enemy movements were now quiet. The operators looked exhausted but proud. They had played a critical role in delivering what everyone knew was a historic blow. One operator, barely 20 years old, told another, "This is how the war changes. This is it." He didn't say it with arrogance, but with awe, like someone looking at a sunrise and realizing it means something. Meanwhile, Japanese survivors, those few who managed to escape the sinking ships, were drifting somewhere far behind in life rafts or clinging to debris. The Americans didn't yet know whether they'd encountered any, but they did know something else: the Japanese command would receive no clear explanation for the loss. No survivor report. No captain's message. Just silence. And that silence would be even more terrifying than the truth. Admirals in Rabaul and Tokyo would sit in war rooms staring at maps, wondering how 4 destroyers simply vanished in the night. They knew the Americans were improving, but this? This was something else. This was dominance. Back on the Dunlap, Moosbrugger gathered his officers in the wardroom for a debriefing. His voice was calm but carried that undercurrent of controlled fire, the tone of a commander who knows his men just executed one of the most precise destroyer operations of the entire Pacific campaign. He asked for every detail: radar timings, firing angles, torpedo trajectories, the exact moment the Japanese formation split. Each officer delivered crisp, detailed accounts. They were not celebrating, they were analyzing. That was Moosbrugger's signature: victory wasn't the end, it was data. Lessons. Future battles waiting to be won. When the meeting ended, Moosbrugger stepped aside for a moment, letting the conversation fade behind him. He thought of the Japanese captains, men who had once prided themselves on their ability to slip through darkness like phantoms. He respected them, even in defeat. But he also knew this victory would send a message: the Americans were no longer the students of night combat. They were now the masters. As the morning wore on, the task group fell back into routine operations. Lookouts scanned the horizon, engineers fine-tuned the engines, and gunnery crews cleaned and cooled their weapons. The sea glittered in the light, looking almost peaceful, betraying no hint of the violence that had erupted across it the night before. Far behind them, the last wisps of smoke rising from the Japanese wrecks drifted into the sky like fading scars. Hours later, when the radio operators finally resumed encoded transmissions, the message they prepared for command was simple but carried the weight of a seismic shift: 3 enemy destroyers sunk. 1 damaged. No friendly casualties. When that report reached Allied headquarters, officers stopped what they were doing. Some repeated the words aloud to make sure they heard them right. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The night was supposed to belong to Japan. Always had. Until now. The after-action analysis that followed was intense. Allied strategists pored over every detail. They highlighted Moosbrugger's torpedo-first doctrine, his refusal to open with guns like traditional engagements, his flawless exploitation of radar, and the disciplined execution of the plan across multiple ships. These weren't just tactical choices, they were innovations. Innovations that would ripple through the entire Pacific Fleet. Destroyer captains across the theater would soon study this battle like scripture. As for the Japanese, the news hit like a gut punch. Their confidence in night operations, once the crown jewel of their naval doctrine, suffered a blow that could not be ignored. Their admirals had expected American improvements, yes, but not a total overthrow of their night supremacy. Rumors began circulating among Japanese crews. Some whispered that the Americans had new secret weapons. Others claimed the Americans were using lights invisible to the naked eye. Many blamed fate. But the truth was simple: radar and doctrine had combined into a new kind of naval warfare, one Japan was not prepared for. By late afternoon, the American destroyers cruised onward, leaving Vela Gulf behind as if it were just another point on the map. The sailors were tired but satisfied. They knew they had been part of something bigger than themselves, a turning point hidden inside a night engagement most people back home would never hear about. That's the irony of war: the biggest shifts often happen quietly, in places far from headlines, under stars no one else sees. As evening approached again, the Gulf now lay calm and empty, the last pieces of wreckage drifting toward nowhere. The Americans had vanished over the horizon, heading back into the vast Pacific with engines humming steadily. And the night, the same night that had once been Japan's greatest weapon, now belonged to a new master. Night had returned to the Solomons like a heavy curtain, spreading over the sea with that familiar, eerie stillness that only war zones truly understand. The American destroyers of Task Group 31.2 were long gone from Vela Gulf, but the weight of what happened there still hung in the air, carried like an invisible echo across the water. While the Americans sailed toward their next mission with confidence strengthened and tactics validated, the Japanese High Command was just beginning to unravel the consequences of the disastrous loss. In distant radio rooms across the Pacific, officers stared at silence where messages from their 4 destroyers should have been. Not a single transmission. Not a single survivor report. Nothing but a dead, empty frequency. And that silence, more than any explosion, hit them with a dread none of them were prepared for. In the chilling absence of information, Japanese commanders pieced together theories. Some believed the Americans had laid a trap with aircraft. Others thought submarines were involved. But none could imagine the truth, that a handful of American destroyers had outthought, outtimed, and outfought an elite Japanese night squadron without suffering a single casualty. The pride of the Imperial Navy, its legendary night fighting skill, had been dismantled in less than 20 minutes. That realization took root like a sickness, spreading through every war room and briefing table. Officers whispered in hallways, asking whether their once superior doctrine had finally reached its limit. Meanwhile, back aboard the American destroyers, the men were settling into the strange normalcy that follows any major battle. The thrill of victory had faded into quiet reflection. Some sailors gathered on the fantail, watching the dark waves slide away behind the ship. Others wrote letters home, trying to put into words an experience that felt too immense for paper. A few simply lay back against the steel, staring at the stars and feeling, for once, like they had conquered not just an enemy, but an entire domain of warfare itself. The sea may have been calm, but inside each man was the lingering fire of what they'd accomplished. Commander Moosbrugger, however, was not a man who lingered in triumph. His mind was already pushing ahead. He had won the night, yes, brilliantly, but he knew how war worked. Victory didn't last unless it was reinforced with discipline, adaptation, and relentless improvement. He gathered his officers again, this time not for a debrief, but for forward planning. They discussed fuel states, potential ambush points on their future patrol routes, enemy reinforcement timelines, and the likely direction Japanese counterattacks would come from. There was no arrogance in his voice. No swagger. Only clarity. He understood that this win wasn't a finish line, it was a beginning. Deep down, though, every officer in that room carried the same private thought: the Japanese would not forget this defeat. And when a proud enemy suffers a humiliating blow, vengeance becomes doctrine. The Americans knew they had to be sharper now, more alert, more calculated. Because somewhere out there, Japanese captains were already recalculating their own tactics, trying to claw back the darkness they had just lost. Hundreds of miles away, in a dimly lit bunker in Rabaul, the Japanese reaction was unfolding in real time. Charts covered the walls, tracking convoys, destroyer groups, and reinforcement routes. When the report finally arrived confirming the loss of not one, not two, but 3 destroyers, with a 4th damaged and missing, disbelief echoed through the room. Admirals demanded answers from subordinates who had none. Intelligence officers reviewed old reconnaissance photographs, trying to see if they had missed signs of new American capabilities. Rumors spread fast, that the Americans had new radar technology, that they had found a way to detect Japanese torpedoes, that their destroyers were now faster than before. Fear disguised as speculation filled the air. In truth, the Japanese Navy was staring at something it had not faced since the war began, a technological wall they had no immediate way to climb. Radar. Not just any radar, but radar used with tactical brilliance. For years, the Japanese had dismissed American radar as untested, unreliable, even primitive. But Vela Gulf proved something terrifying: radar wasn't just reliable, it was decisive. And the Americans knew how to use it in ways the Japanese had never anticipated. As hours passed, Japanese strategists outlined new strategies: nighttime zigzag routes, increased lookout rotations, and contingency plans for ambushes. But none of these addressed the core shift. The Americans could now see through darkness. The Japanese could not. Every doctrine that had defined their night operations was suddenly under threat. Back on the American ships, midnight approached again, but the night felt different, lighter somehow. The men didn't speak much about the victory anymore because they didn't need to. It was imprinted into them, woven into their nerves like a new instinct. From now on, when they looked into the dark horizon, they wouldn't feel the old tension or dread. They had faced the legendary Japanese night fleet, and destroyed it. As the destroyers sliced through the waves, Moosbrugger finally stepped outside alone for a moment. The stars shimmered above him, the same way they had the night before, yet everything had changed. He knew that historians might overlook Vela Gulf, overshadowed by bigger battles like Leyte Gulf or Guadalcanal. But those 17 minutes would echo through the war in ways few could predict. It was the night when technology, intelligence, and discipline fused into something unstoppable. And as the engines rumbled beneath his feet and the ships pushed deeper into the Pacific, Moosbrugger felt the certainty settle in his chest: the night no longer belonged to Japan. And it would never belong to them again. The night deepened over the Pacific, settling like a heavy curtain as Task Group 61 pushed silently forward, its ships cutting through the black water with disciplined calm. For hours, the men aboard had been carrying the weight of an uneasy quiet, one of those silences where everyone knows the storm is coming, even if no one can see it yet. By 22:30 hours, the carrier decks were humming with restrained energy. Pilots sat strapped into their cockpits, faces dimly lit by flickering consoles. Some whispered quick prayers, others tapped gloved fingers against the controls, running muscle memory through imaginary takeoffs. And below them, the launch crews handled every cable, every chock, every elevator movement with the kind of precision that comes only from repetition hammered in by necessity. They all understood what was unfolding tonight. The Japanese fleet wasn't guessing, wasn't searching, they were coming, and everyone on this side of the ocean could feel the tremor of inevitability under their boots. At 2255 hours, the sharp, piercing tone of radar contact sliced through the carrier's comm like a knife. Operators snapped upright, calling out bearings in rapid, overlapping bursts. The display screens glowed with a cluster of returns, tight, fast, purposeful. Not wandering scouts. Not small detachments. This was a concentrated force, and a big one. Multiple bogies, closing fast, the operator confirmed, voice tight but steady. The Japanese strike wave had found them. The carrier's combat information centers came alive with motion. Officers leaned over glowing tables, shifting markers across maps, plotting ranges and times with the urgency of men threading a needle in the dark. Orders shot down the corridors. Ready rooms erupted in activity. The entire ship felt like it took one massive breath. When the Japanese planes broke through the final stretch of darkness and hit visual range, the world shifted from silent tension to instant, explosive violence. The carriers opened fire first, tracers streaking into the sky like glowing ropes. Seconds later, the destroyers added their flak, carving orange-lit patterns into the black. The enemy craft swooped low, engines screaming, torpedoes dropping into the water with vicious splashes that echoed across the formation. Anti-aircraft gunners tracked them desperately, their barrels glowing from constant firing. Every gunner had one job: don't let even one attacker get close enough to cripple the carriers. The Japanese formation was disciplined, fearless, and fast, diving through the bursts of fire with alarming precision. Torpedoes churned white paths toward the escort screen, forcing ships to turn hard, decks tilting as crews clung to railings and levers. Inside the carriers, damage control teams were already sprinting before the first bombs hit. They knew the drill: smoke, fire, flooding. These weren't surprises, just obstacles to be punched through. When a bomb exploded near the forward elevator, a steel blast wave rolled across the deck like a giant's fist. Debris scattered. Men were thrown, some picking themselves up instantly, others carried away for treatment. But no one stopped. On the hangar deck, crews shoved aircraft out of danger zones, locked down fuel lines, sealed compartments, and fought flames that licked up the bulkheads like hungry orange tongues. It was chaos, but it was a controlled chaos, one they were trained to survive. Above the carriers, American fighters tore into the Japanese formation with ferocious determination. Dogfights spiraled across the night sky, trails of smoke, flashes of gunfire, silhouettes colliding in violent bursts. Pilots called out to each other through clipped radio transmissions, trying to hold the line long enough for their carriers to regain stability. But the Japanese didn't break easily. Even damaged planes pushed toward the fleet, some trailing fire, some barely holding together, but all still diving with lethal intent. 1-0 plunged so low that its wingtips skimmed the wave tops before it exploded against the starboard side of a destroyer in a shower of flame and metal. The ship shuddered but stayed in formation, sailors rushing to contain the blast. Then, just when the defenders thought the attack might be thinning, a second wave appeared, larger, tighter, even more determined. The sky darkened again with engines buzzing like an approaching swarm. The carriers braced. This was the moment that separated survival from annihilation. The bridge teams coordinated every evasive maneuver with split-second precision, shouting orders against the thunder of explosions. The ships zigzagged violently, trying to spoil torpedo angles while maintaining enough stability for deck operations. Planes were being loaded with fuel and ammunition below, ready for counterattack, but only if the carriers could stay afloat long enough to launch them. The second assault hit harder. Torpedoes struck close enough to send fountains of water surging skyward, soaking the decks and rattling even thick steel beams. Bombs fell in punishing chains, their impact zones overlapping. Yet somehow, through all of it, the fleet held together. Not unscathed, never that, but unbroken. Damage control teams sealed compartments, rerouted power, isolated fires, pumped out flooding, and saved men pinned under debris. Pilots kept strafing enemy planes until their ammunition counters hit zero. Gunners stayed at their stations even when the heat blistered their arms. Everyone gave everything they had. By 01:20 hours, the surviving Japanese aircraft finally peeled away, what remained of their wave limping back into the night. The carriers, battered but alive, let the tension drain slowly from their decks. Smoke drifted in long trails above them. The sea was littered with fragments, wreckage, splintered floats, burning fuel patches drifting on the current. But the formation was still intact. Crews stood at their stations, breaths heavy, uniforms scorched, hands trembling from adrenaline. They had taken the worst the enemy could throw and refused to break. As the night settled again, quieter now, the men knew they were standing in the aftermath of something that could have ended far differently. They had endured a storm of metal, fire, and screaming engines, and emerged with their ship still moving, still fighting. The horizon held no more incoming threats for now, just the dim outline of dawn slowly pushing against the darkness. And for a moment, as the faint first light washed across the fractured sea, the entire task group felt the weight of survival settle in, a heavy, exhausted, grateful breath shared silently across 1,000 men who had stared into the fire and refused to fall. Dawn crept over the edge of the Pacific like a slow-burning fuse, casting a cold silver glow across the scattered wreckage drifting in the waves. The ocean was quieter now, eerily so, as if the night's violence had drained all sound from the world. But for the men aboard Task Group 61, there was no calm, no relief, only the grinding weight of exhaustion and the knowledge that the fight wasn't over yet. Damage control crews moved across the decks like ghosts, stepping around twisted steel, scorched planking, and aircraft carcasses that had burned down to their frames. Every hose, axe, crowbar, and patching plate was in motion. They climbed ladders slick with sea spray and oil, ducked beneath ruptured beams, and worked through the lingering smoke that hung in pockets like trapped memories of the attack. Their eyes were red, their voices hoarse, but they refused to slow down. If a seam could be sealed, they sealed it. If a fire threatened to spark back to life, they drowned it. Survival depended on speed and stubbornness, and the men had plenty of both. Below deck, the carriers felt like living organisms, wounded but refusing to die. Electricians crawled through half-flooded compartments to reroute blown circuits. Engineers pounded at bent valves to force them operational again. Medical teams worked shoulder to shoulder over makeshift tables, sleeves soaked in blood as they stitched, bandaged, and fought to save whoever they could. Every corridor echoed with clattering tools, shouted updates, and the steady thrum of pumps fighting back the sea. And through it all, officers kept circling through the chaos, offering quiet reassurances, redirecting efforts, and holding together the morale of men who'd worked through the night without a moment's rest. By mid-morning, the carriers were scarred but stable, steadying themselves like prizefighters who refused to stay down after a punishing round. But even as repairs continued, life aboard didn't pause for long. The flight decks, battered though they were, had to be cleared, swept, and organized. They would need to launch again soon, because nobody believed the Japanese were done. Aircraft mechanics stepped over blast craters to drag fresh planes into position. Some engines still sputtered when tested, coughing out black smoke before settling into steady rhythms. Crews reloaded ammunition belts, fueled tanks, aligned flak guns, and checked every control cable with hands that shook from fatigue. It didn't matter how tired they were. The enemy had shown last night that they'd throw everything into the fight. The Americans had no choice but to be ready. By the time the sun pushed high enough to bleach the sky into a hard blue, the horizon started whispering new danger. Radar picked up faint returns, not the chaotic scatter of lost planes, but the deliberate formation of another wave. The Japanese were coming again. When the report reached the decks, no one groaned, complained, or flinched. They just moved faster. Pilots strapped in. Gunners tightened grips on their triggers. The carriers angled into the wind. The briefing officers hadn't even finished speaking before the first flights were rolling down the decks, their wheels leaving the planks with barely a whisper. A fresh line of fighters rose into the air, banking in tight circles to form a defensive screen. Above them, the sky thickened with tension again. The Japanese attackers came in lower and more aggressively than the night before, as if they wanted to smash their way through sheer will. When they crested the horizon, dozens of them in tight, dark silhouettes, the American fighters hit them first. Engines roared as both sides collided in a swirling ballet of spirals, dives, and blistering machine gun bursts. Some planes caught fire instantly, tumbling into the sea like flaming wreckage tossed by unseen hands. Others clung to the fight, weaving and climbing, spinning through clouds of tracer fire. Pilots grunted against G-forces, barked warnings into radios, and forced their machines to the limits. But for every Japanese plane shot down in the air, more slipped through. Soon the carriers and cruisers were engulfed in another storm of shrieking engines and explosive thunder. Bombs dropped in deadly arcs, missing by yards or exploding against armored deck plates. Torpedoes churned the sea into angry white scars, sending geysers surging past hulls. The ships zigzagged, creating long crescents of wake as they danced between death and survival. Gunners on the flight decks fired non-stop, their shoulders bruised, ears ringing, hands blistered as they fed round after round into the hungry barrels. Smoke drifted in thick clouds, swirling into the sky like giant charcoal smudges. A bomb struck close to the port side of one carrier, the shockwaves slamming through the deck like a hammer. The ship trembled, but didn't break. Damage control launched instantly, hatches slammed shut, hoses hissed, shouts bounced down every hallway. The men fought the chaos like a living beast, refusing to let it grow. Flames were smothered, flooding slowed, debris hauled aside. Every minute they held the ship stable was another minute the fleet stayed alive. By noon, the second attack started to crack. The Americans' relentless defense, air and sea, forced the Japanese wave into disarray. Damaged planes peeled off, engines sputtering. Others turned back to preserve what fuel they had left. And slowly, one by one, the attackers dwindled. The sky cleared in patches, revealing streaks of smoke drifting above the fleet like tangled ribbons. The roar faded. The last enemy plane dropped out of sight, retreating toward the vast blue horizon. And just like that, the echo of battle faded into uneasy quiet once more. But the fleet knew better than to celebrate. The carriers had survived 2 crushing blows, but the day wasn't over, not by a long shot. Officers gathered in the briefing rooms with maps still pinned open from earlier, sweat running down their temples as they exchanged grim glances. The Japanese weren't just testing the line, they were trying to break it. And with every attack, they were getting closer. If the fleet wanted to stay alive, they'd have to strike back. Hard. On the decks, the men felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable. The defensive mindset that had carried them through the night and morning was changing. They weren't just patching holes now. They weren't just bracing for survival. They were preparing to take action. To throw a punch back. Aircraft crews moved with a different kind of urgency, almost hungry, loading torpedoes with renewed purpose. Pilots exchanged quick nods. The carrier decks, still scarred and blackened, began to feel like launch pads for something bigger. The sun continued its climb, uncaring of the carnage below, casting sharp shadows across the battle group. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet was maneuvering, regrouping, planning its next move. But now, for the first time since the attack began, Task Group 61 wasn't just holding the line. It was getting ready to fire back, and the men could feel the shift in their bones. Afternoon light settled unevenly across the Pacific, the waves carrying a faint shimmer that didn't match the mood hanging over the fleet. Every ship in the task group felt the strain of the last hours, decks dented, hulls blackened, crews running on the thin edge of exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was something harder, sharper: resolve. They had spent the night surviving blow after blow, fending off 2 furious Japanese strike waves, but survival alone wasn't going to win the day. As the carrier flag officers gathered, maps spread out across tables still vibrating from earlier explosions, the decision came swiftly and without hesitation: now it was their turn to strike. Communications officers transmitted the launch orders with clipped urgency while flight crews on deck snapped into motion like men suddenly propelled by an electric surge. On the flight decks, the shift in mood was palpable. Gone were the frantic defensive scrambles, the desperate attempts to get planes into the air before another enemy wave arrived. This was different. This was controlled, methodical preparation. The sailors rolled torpedoes along grooved tracks, the heavy cylinders gleaming in the sun as crews guided them with practiced precision. Armorers sprinted between planes, checking straps, locking clamps, securing payloads with a mechanical rhythm that bordered on instinct. Mechanics tightened final bolts, rechecked fuel lines, and wiped down oil streaks with movements sharpened by the knowledge that these planes weren't flying to defend, they were flying to kill. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with a focus that could have cut steel. Their faces carried the exhaustion of a night spent under fire, but their eyes burned with something entirely different: purpose. Some adjusted oxygen masks, some tapped instruments idly, some stared straight ahead as if picturing the enemy ships already burning on the horizon. They'd fought in the air all night, but this mission felt heavier. This was their chance to turn the tide, maybe even end the enemy's ability to launch the next wave. And everyone aboard the carriers knew exactly what that meant. By the time the first engines began spinning up, a low rumble vibrated through the decks, rising into a steady, hungry roar. The ships angled into the wind again, their bows cutting across the waves with renewed determination. Officers shouted final checks, arms raised, flags waving. Then, as if released from a coiled spring, the first aircraft thundered down the deck, wheels lifting cleanly as it leapt into the bright afternoon sky. One after another, the planes launched: dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighter escorts, each rising into a tightening formation that sparkled like a spearhead of sunlit metal. The fleet watched them go with a mix of pride and worry. There was something haunting about seeing dozens of planes fade into the horizon, knowing that some wouldn't return, knowing that the mission ahead was packed with danger. But the silence that followed their departure wasn't empty, it thrummed with anticipation. The carriers had taken their beating. Now they were handing one back. As the strike group pushed farther from the fleet, the sea below them stretched endlessly, a rolling blue road leading straight toward the enemy. The pilots maintained radio discipline, checking bearings, watching fuel usage, scanning the sky for any interceptors. The tension filled every cockpit like thick fog. Minutes dragged by slowly, each one tying another knot of anticipation inside their chests. Then, at last, the Japanese fleet began to emerge on the horizon, shadowed shapes at first, then clear outlines, cruisers, destroyers, and at the center, the unmistakable silhouette of a carrier. The American formation tightened instantly. Fighters swept ahead, scanning for defenders. Bombers dipped slightly to begin their attack runs. Torpedo planes lowered altitude until they skimmed the waves, their engines echoing across the water like distant thunder. The Japanese had spotted them now, ships below scrambling, decks roaring with activity, anti-aircraft guns swiveling toward the incoming assault. The sky thickened with tracer fire in seconds, glowing orange streams reaching up like claws. But the American squadrons didn't flinch. They broke into disciplined attack patterns, peeling off in layered waves. Dive bombers soared upward, climbing steeply before pivoting into deadly vertical plunges that pointed their noses directly at Japanese carriers. Pilots wrestled through shuddering winds, the G-forces slamming them against their harnesses, the world spinning into a blur until the moment they steadied their sights. Bombs released with sharp metallic clicks. Seconds later, fireballs erupted below, sending black pillars of smoke spiraling into the sky. Meanwhile, the torpedo planes hurtled across the waves at terrifyingly low altitude, weaving through flak bursts that detonated dangerously close, spraying shrapnel across their wings. Pilots gritted their teeth, holding steady as they lined up firing angles. Torpedoes splashed into the sea, slicing through the water with lethal precision toward the Japanese hulls. Ships twisted violently to evade them, wakes foaming white, but not all succeeded. When the first torpedo slammed into a cruiser's flank, the explosion split through the fleet's noise like a thunderclap. Flames rippled upward, debris raining across the water. The Japanese defenders fought back with ferocity. Fighters launched into the air, diving through chaotic patterns to chase the American bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries fired so relentlessly that some barrels glowed red. Pilots screamed warnings through radios, "Zero behind you. Brake left." As dogfights erupted in tight spirals above the burning ships. The sky became a battlefield of smoke, fire, and desperate maneuvers. But despite the chaos, the American assault held its momentum. Bomb after bomb found its mark. Torpedoes carved their deadly paths. Carriers were hit, destroyers damaged, and columns of smoke soon marked where proud ships once steamed at full speed. The Japanese formations faltered under the relentless pressure, the fleet scattering as captains tried to preserve what remained of their force. As fuel gauges dipped lower and ammunition counters neared empty, the American pilots finally pulled away from the battlefield, leaving behind a sea scarred with flame and shattered metal. The flight back to the fleet felt longer, heavier. Some planes limped home with torn wings, leaking fuel, bullet-scarred fuselages. Others never made it back at all, swallowed by the ocean or claimed by fire. But when the returning squadrons approached the carriers, radios crackled with relief, "I see you. I see you, coming in now." The decks erupted into motion again as the first plane touched down, tailhook catching, wheels bouncing along the planks. One after another, the battered planes landed, some sliding, some thudding hard, but they made it. Crewmen rushed to help pilots climb out, patting their shoulders, guiding them toward rest after the longest, hardest flight of their lives. Back inside the command room, the reports painted the story clearly, a decisive blow. The Japanese offensive power had been crushed. Their ability to launch the next strike was crippled. The balance of the battle had shifted, finally, toward the Americans. For the first time since the night began, the fleet felt a surge of something warm, faint but undeniable, hope. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a critical phase, with the Allies gaining momentum after key victories at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Solomon Islands. Japan, though still formidable, was beginning to feel the strain of extended supply lines, attrition, and increasingly effective Allied air and naval power. Allied commanders recognized that decisive battles in the Central and Southwest Pacific would determine control of the region and that careful planning and coordination would be essential to maintain the advantage. Drawing on lessons learned from earlier campaigns, the Allies had refined their amphibious warfare strategies. Marines and Army units were trained for combined operations that emphasized the coordination of naval gunfire, air support, and ground assaults. Logistic planning had become more sophisticated, ensuring that landing forces were equipped with sufficient supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to sustain prolonged engagements. At the same time, Japanese forces anticipated Allied offensives and fortified key islands with airfields, coastal defenses, and entrenched positions in dense jungle terrain. Their strategy of defense in depth aimed to inflict maximum casualties and delay the Allies, while psychological tactics such as night attacks, banzai charges, and booby traps were used to demoralize invading forces. Intelligence and reconnaissance became vital for both sides, with the Allies employing signals intelligence, coast watchers, and aerial surveillance to track Japanese troop movements and fortifications. This information allowed commanders to plan landings on less defended beaches, anticipate ambushes, and coordinate preemptive airstrikes to weaken enemy positions before ground forces engaged. Allied leaders, including Admirals Halsey and King and Generals MacArthur and Patch, planned offensives aimed at capturing strategically important islands while isolating Japanese bases. Their goal was not merely territorial gain but also to disrupt supply lines, secure airfields, and prepare staging points for operations that would eventually bring them closer to the Philippines and Japan. Achieving air superiority was central to this strategy, as long-range bombers and carrier-based aircraft targeted Japanese installations, shipping, and troop concentrations. Control of the skies allowed for more effective naval bombardment, reduced casualties during amphibious landings, and disrupted Japanese supply and reinforcement efforts. The Japanese continued to use the slot, a narrow passage through the Solomon Islands, to move reinforcements and supplies, challenging Allied naval commanders to intercept these movements while minimizing losses. Technological advancements such as radar and improved night fighting tactics provided the Allies with an increasing advantage, allowing them to anticipate Japanese maneuvers and engage under favorable conditions. When Allied forces landed on targeted islands, they faced a combination of fortified positions, jungle obstacles, and determined defenders. Early engagements tested the flexibility and coordination of the troops, requiring rapid adaptation to terrain, enemy tactics, and logistical constraints. Marines and soldiers relied heavily on prior training, improvisation, and cooperation with naval and air units to secure beachheads and establish footholds for further operations. Despite being outnumbered, Japanese forces launched fierce counterattacks, employing night assaults, infiltration tactics, and strategic withdrawals designed to inflict casualties and delay consolidation. These engagements highlighted Japan's reliance on discipline, morale, and tactical ingenuity, even when facing overwhelming Allied firepower and technological advantages. Following initial landings and skirmishes, Allied forces focused on consolidating their positions, repairing supply lines, and preparing for further inland operations. Each encounter provided valuable lessons in coordination, intelligence application, and combined arms tactics, lessons that would inform subsequent campaigns and help maintain momentum in the Pacific. The cumulative effect of these operations underscored a turning point in the war, as the Allies increasingly dictated the pace and scope of engagements, gradually shifting the initiative and demonstrating that careful planning, technological advantage, and coordinated execution were decisive in overcoming even the most determined defenses. By mid-1944, the pace of the Pacific campaign accelerated as the Allies advanced toward the Mariana and Palau Islands, aiming to establish airfields capable of supporting long-range bombing missions against Japan. The Japanese, aware of the strategic importance of these islands, reinforced their garrisons with troops, artillery, and coastal defenses, preparing for fierce resistance. The Allies relied on a combination of overwhelming naval firepower, coordinated air attacks, and carefully planned amphibious landings to seize these fortified positions. Intelligence played a crucial role, with reconnaissance planes mapping enemy defenses, intercepted communications revealing troop movements, and resistance reports from locals providing insights into terrain and supply routes. The landings required precise timing, with pre-invasion bombardments softening defenses while landing craft brought troops to the beaches under intense enemy fire. Engineers and support units worked tirelessly to clear obstacles, establish beachheads, and set up supply chains to sustain the advancing forces. Meanwhile, naval engagements tested the limits of fleet coordination, as Japanese kamikaze attacks, submarines, and remaining surface vessels sought to disrupt operations. Air superiority proved decisive, with carrier-based aircraft striking targets deep inland and providing close support to ground troops, gradually eroding Japanese defensive capabilities. Morale, discipline, and leadership were constantly challenged on both sides, as troops faced exhaustion, disease, and the psychological toll of relentless combat. Every successful landing, captured airfield, and neutralized defensive position highlighted the strategic importance of preparation, coordination, and adaptability in overcoming entrenched enemies. By systematically isolating and capturing key islands, the Allies cut off Japanese supply lines, limited their ability to reinforce positions, and created a network of bases to support further advances toward the Japanese mainland. These operations demonstrated the combined effectiveness of land, sea, and air forces working in unison, and each hard-won victory served as a stepping stone in the larger strategy to bring the Pacific War to a decisive conclusion. As the Pacific Campaign reached its final stages, the Allies prepared for the climactic operations that would bring Japan to the brink of surrender. Strategic bombing had weakened industrial capacity, while naval blockades and submarine attacks disrupted supply chains, leaving Japanese forces increasingly isolated and undersupplied. The planned invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were critical, not only for their strategic locations but also for the psychological impact on both Japanese defenders and Allied troops. These operations demanded meticulous planning, with careful coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and amphibious assaults to minimize casualties while maximizing effectiveness against fortified positions. Troops faced extremely harsh conditions, from rugged terrain and entrenched enemy positions to disease, fatigue, and unpredictable weather, testing their endurance and resolve. The Japanese defenders employed desperate measures, including kamikaze attacks and last-stand resistance, seeking to inflict maximum losses and delay the inevitable. Each advance required courage, improvisation, and steadfast leadership, as small units often had to adapt to shifting battlefield conditions and unexpected enemy tactics. The capture of these islands enabled the Allies to establish airfields and staging areas for potential invasion of the Japanese home islands, bringing long-range bombers within striking distance and tightening the strategic noose. Civilian populations in occupied areas also endured immense hardships, highlighting the human cost of prolonged warfare. By the end of these campaigns, the cumulative effect of relentless pressure, superior logistics, and overwhelming firepower left Japan with limited options, ultimately setting the stage for surrender after the atomic bombings and the Soviet entry into the war. The final operations of the Pacific Theater underscored the interplay of strategy, technology, leadership, and human endurance, demonstrating how meticulous preparation, combined arms coordination, and unyielding determination shaped the outcome of one of history's most challenging campaigns.